everyone. This is Bill Griffin. Welcome to the Different Take podcast. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. And today, I really appreciate Mr. Jack Bernard joining me. Jack is a resident in Peachtree City, Georgia. He was the former director of health planning in Georgia. He's the current chair of the Board of Health in Fayette County. Is a past chairman of the Jasper County Commission. He has published political commentary for about 20 years and has been published in about 50 different organizations. And thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to start with the column you did on COVID-19, and I understand you back in the beginning, you had predicted 2 million fatalities in total, and in a column that you written earlier this year that you expected that the United States would hit that number. So I was curious, what time frame were you?
Probably within the next couple of years. We're averaging probably 1,000 or so cases a day. When I wrote that, we're down to probably 600 now, but when the BA2 variant comes in, and it should come in within a month, we'll be back up towards 1,000 a day. So my general guess is we'll probably hit 300,000 or 400,000 deaths this year, maybe that much the year after, unless people get vaccinated. The overall vaccination rate in the US is about 66% now, and that's for 2 shots. That's not for the booster. Only about 1/3 of the people who have 2 shots actually have the 3rd booster, and hardly anyone's got the 4th booster. So this is sort of like the flu when you think about it. You're going to have to get boosters. And I was watching Fox News the other day, and one of the commentators was complaining about, we shouldn't have to get shots every 3 to 6 months. Well, you shouldn't have to get them annually for the flu, but you do. And COVID, my prediction from the beginning is COVID is going to be like the flu because it's very similar epidemiologically. And if you read the epidemiologists, that's what they say. It's going to be recurring. So I think the 2 million is probably on the mark. When I wrote that was at the beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago, and everyone thought I was exaggerating and so on and so on. Right now we've got 1 million, and that's in 2 years. We should have another 1 million within another 3.
Okay. So 66% that's the entire population.
Yeah, the entire population,
including people under the age of 35 or 5.
Yeah, it varies. Whatever. Usually the people that are our age, Bill, are getting the inoculations, which is good. In my county, they say 100% of the people have been inoculated. That's not really accurate, but that's what they're saying, is that 100% of the people over 65 have been inoculated. It's not that high for Georgia. My county is particularly high in terms of inoculations, which is sort of an anomaly because this county is heavily Republican, very conservative, but still people are getting the shots. The biggest problem with people getting vaccinations has been the politicization of vaccinations by both parties. Medicine is not political. It shouldn't be political, but it has been politicized and should never have been politicized. And by the way, neither president has done an excellent job with COVID. Trump did a horrible job basically by denying it, and Biden hasn't done many of the things he should have done. So, we've learned, but the CDC made a lot of mistakes up front, such as not being clear about why they weren't asking people to have masks up front. They wanted to reserve the masks for medical personnel, but that's not really what they said. Now they've lifted the mask mandate, in my opinion, too early, because we're about to go into another cycle, another wave. And still, even today, we've got, a large number of people dying in this country every day of COVID.
Do we think oh, I'm sorry. Just assume, because I don't know, maybe total US fatalities, all causes, it's 3 million a year, right? Do you know if that's about right?
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Yes, let's just say that it is. So
I do know that the number two cause of fatality in this country last year was COVID, right under heart attacks.
Okay, so but let's just say it's 3 million. So and of course there's going to be population increase, so the number of fatalities would probably increase. But let's just assume that it's stable, and that so 3 million times 4 years, 12 million. And what you're saying is there'd be another 2 million on top of the 12 million, or is it 2 million? Those people statistically might have died anyway, not statistically, but of the 2 million, they might have died anyway. So I just want to understand the prediction.
Yeah, that's an interesting premise, because people that are dying of COVID plus something else generally are not being counted as COVID. They're being counted as something else. So the COVID numbers are, if anything, an undercount right now. And that's been proven by various studies. So as opposed to what you might read in some of the right-wing newsletters that I get, it's not overcounted for COVID. It's being undercounted for COVID, according to the academic studies. And yeah, there would be primarily on top of the things that people are dying from now. If you've got, if you're an aging person, if you've got someone who's 65 years old, yeah, the chances are greater that they're going to pass away of something, but they're much greater they're going to pass away if they get COVID and haven't had inoculations. If they've had the inoculations, they may get COVID and get something similar to a flu, but they won't be dying. That seems to be the big preventive measure with the vaccines now, is the severity of the illness rather than not getting it at all, because the current waves are so contagious.
So this is from a column, same topic, and I want to talk about a few topics, because you write about a number of different subjects. But so this is from, I believe, August of 2020, that you were advocating that that Brian Kemp's previous orders in March, April, May were ineffective, and that we should go back to some pretty severe restrictions. So my question is, do you advocate when should that have ended, if it should have ended, or looking back, do you think that wasn't necessary, or what's your opinion now looking back?
I think generally that in general, red states, because of the politicization of vaccinations, have not moved strongly enough on mandates for things like vaccinations, things like masking. There's no reason to wear a mask if you're outdoors. I see people outdoors wearing masks all the time, and that's ridiculous. You don't need to be.
Even in large public gatherings?
If people are jammed together, yeah, they do need to wear them. But I've been to, football games and so on outside where people are not wearing them. I wear them anyway, because some people are very close to you. But generally, you don't have to wear them outside. Inside, you should be wearing them. I'm a season ticket holder for Georgia State basketball games. One of the reasons I stopped going to the basketball games and just forfeited my tickets is I was the only one wearing a mask. And a lot of the people were elderly at those games. A lot of them were kids, but a lot of them were elderly. So some of this is common sense. If you're going to go into a restaurant and eat, I don't see much sense in wearing a mask, because you're going to be taking the mask off immediately when you get in to eat. But if you're frankly, if you're presenting to a group, it doesn't make much sense to wear the mask because they can't hear you. So you have to be reasonable about the mask mandates. But if you're in a supermarket, yeah, why not wear the mask? In the midst of the epidemic, even when they had signs up at Kroger's and Publix asking people to wear masks, saying that they're mandated, a lot of people weren't wearing them. And again, it's because of the politicization of the vaccinations and the masks. And that's a shame, because medicine is medicine. Doesn't matter if you're liberal or progressive or conservative.
See, these restrictions that you were advocating for in August 2020, when, in your opinion, should they have stopped, if ever?
I think what we ought to do is follow the CDC's advice, and the CDC needs to be less political than it's been. The CDC needs to look at the science, figure out the transmission rates, and then make recommendations. And they've generally been good at it, but they haven't been perfect at it. They've been influenced by politics, both in the last administration and somewhat in this administration.
One thing that's, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people, when they weigh the benefits and the cost in their own lives and the lives of the people around them, there's not overwhelming evidence that the benefits outweigh the costs. Is that the way you see it?
It depends on the circumstances. Like, let's take schools. Schools are a great example of something that's very difficult to come down one way or the other. Children generally, if they get the virus, don't get very sick, although some do. My son's a pediatric intensivist, and he has seen children with COVID in his pediatric intensive care unit. But if you were going to ask him, do children need to wear masks? He would say no, because so few of them get the virus and get sick enough to be in a hospital. On the other hand, you've got elderly teachers that are teaching, and you've got a lot of, frankly, elderly people working in the cafeteria, and janitors and so on, and they can pick it up. So should the kids wear it? That's debatable. Should the people that are around the kids be wearing it? Yeah, they should. They definitely should.
Do you think these restrictions should have continued from March 2020 up until the present day?
I think we should follow the CDC guidance on masks. If they say continue, we should continue. If they recommend not continuing, we shouldn't. What I objected to with Governor Kemp is he was violating CDC guidelines. He was ignoring them for political reasons.
Okay, so I want to move on to a different topic. So you wrote a column regarding Kyle Rhittenhouse, and so I'll just start with this. You're pretty critical of the judge allowing the use of the word victims to describe the two people that were shot. I was curious, you don't think that would be the violation of the defendant's rights, because that's why they're having the trials, to determine whether the people that were shot were innocent of wrongdoing?
I think that the judge was biased from the start in the case, and every decision that he made in the case was pro-defendant and not balanced. The three people.
But explain if you don't mind how. I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt.
They were victims of gun violence. One of them had a gun, and in that case, that's questionable about whether it was whether he should have been found guilty, because the other person had a gun. The other two didn't have guns. And if you've got a gun, you and I'm a gun owner, I wouldn't go shoot somebody that is not armed, and that essentially two of them weren't.
How does the word victim, the jury is not aware of them. They shouldn't be aware, and I'm presuming they weren't aware that the judge made this ruling. So how does that damage the prosecution's ability to obtain a conviction by borrowing that word?
Well, how do they refer to the people that were frankly murdered by Rittenhouse if they don't call them victims? They can, the judge implied they should call them rioters. I mean, and that's not fair to the people who were murdered. So,
Well, yes, but the murderers aren't on trial. I mean, the people that were shot were not, they weren't on trial.
no, but justice is on trial, and justice needs to be balanced. And in this case, the judge was not balanced.
So I'm just curious I'm fascinated by these high profile cases, and to a certain extent, because what happens there happens in everyday life. So someone's unarmed, that in itself does not mean they're a victim, does it?
If someone is shot and they weren't physically, hurting the other individual, then I assume that they are victims. When someone's got a gun, and as one of them did, and the other person, Rittenhouse, shoots them because he's afraid of his life, that's different. I think it's different when the police officers in Louisville shot Breonna Taylor. Her boyfriend had shot back at them, and they were simply defending themselves. Now they shot 30 or 40 times, which was excessive, but they were defending themselves because her boyfriend had shot at them. And I think that, frankly, the result of that trial was fair, even though no-knock warrants need to be restricted much more than they are now. But still, if you put yourself in the shoes of the officers, they were being shot at. Kyle Rhittenhouse was not being shot at.
So you pretty critical of the, and correct me if I'm wrong, I might have misinterpreted it, of the jury in the Rittenhouse case. I'm curious, what visual evidence told you that of the three different incidents, because I think there's 5 charges or something, but the two people that died and the one person was injured, what visual evidence did you see that said this guy's a murderer?
I'd have to go back and look at the tapes again. I did look at the tapes at the time. It's been, a year, so I don't remember, but I did look at the tapes, and to me, I thought that shooting them was unwarranted at the time. This is a 17-year-old kid. I think, frankly, that the parents should have been on trial for permitting him to have a rifle and have a gun and go out there to start with. His mother ferried him in from Illinois, which is basically, she was the provocateur, not the child. And that's what Rittenhouse was. He was a child running around with a high-powered rifle. So I think the mother was even more at fault than Kyle Rhittenhouse, to be honest with you.
The visual evidence that I saw, and I mean, this may jog your memory, but Rosenbaum was chasing Rittenhouse, the testimony was he was going to take his gun and kill him. That was the testimony. So that was the first incident. The guy with a handgun, I don't see any reason to go into that unless you want to. But the second guy was swinging a skateboard at him, struck him. He's on the ground and was about to strike him again. And so he shoots him. So you don't think the jury looked at that and said, you just didn't, he's innocent until proven guilty, irrespective of what you think of his mother, if he's a white supremacist or any of that stuff. he's still innocent until proven guilty. And it just, for a lot of people, they say the prosecution just didn't prove their case, did they?
I think the prosecution could have put on a better case, but in the case of Rosenbaum, he was just plain murdered. Now, the others actually saw Rosenbaum be murdered, and they were going to, frankly, try to do a citizen's arrest on the person who had murdered Rosenbaum. So, if we get into citizens and citizens taking the law into their own hands, you can't say one can take the law into his own hands and then the other one can't, to try to rectify a murder.
So you just want to make sure I understand. Your understanding is that Rosenbaum was completely innocent and did nothing wrong.
I think Rosenbaum was a mentally ill person, but he did not deserve to die.
I understand that, but Rittenhouse wouldn't have known that, would he?
Dead. No, but that doesn't justify him shooting him either. If I see somebody screaming and yelling in front of my house, and I've got a pistol and a shotgun in my house, I'm not justified in going out and shooting him. I'm justified in calling the police, but I'm not justified in going out and shooting him.
Well, no, but if a person attacked you from behind, you'd be and you have the gun, and they know you have the gun, then you would be justified in shooting them, wouldn't you?
It depends on the situation.
Right. Depends on the situation, of course.
On the situation.
You wouldn't necessarily be unjustified in shooting them.
Yeah, it depends on the situation.
Right. So I'm curious. Now, this is something I'm really curious about. Is so in elections, and this is kind of off the wall question, but you've written enough about this where I think this should be an interesting answer. I think. Do you think it would be a good idea for people when they vote that their votes are public record? In other words, you could go online and you could see how did Bill Griffin vote on every office and that sort of thing. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Probably not, because your votes should be private. But I do think that it's absolutely necessary to keep a physical copy as well as an electronic copy, which most states are doing, but there's a handful of states now that are not keeping a physical copy. And in those states, they could be tampered. The vote could be tampered with, especially by folks like Russia, who've already tampered with our elections. China may end up doing the same thing, because Russia got away with it. So good China. And Iran and some of the others have tried to play with it. So we need to keep a physical copy of the vote.
It seems to me it'd be going back to the history of why people vote in secret, because my understanding is back in the 1800s, people would, this idea of voting in secret, they were called cowards and all this kind of stuff. But the problem was that was a potential for harassing and intimidating people to vote.
I think that's
a certain way.
I think that's still true on the left and the right.
Yes,
there are people on the left that if you're voting for Brian Kemp, they're going to be very upset. There are people on the right that if you're voting for Stacey Abrams, they're going to be very upset. With me, I'm pretty open about the way I feel about things, but a lot of people don't want to be that open about the way they feel. I know several people in my neighborhood who are closet Democrats, but they don't want anyone to know that they're Democrats. Because this neighborhood I live in is heavily Republican, very conservative. So those people probably wouldn't vote. Same thing, you get a Republican in New York City. He doesn't want people to know he's a Republican if he's on the East Side, Upper East Side. He doesn't want his name out there because all of his neighbors are liberal Democrats. So it is a difficult situation.
What's the distinction between the opportunity to be intimidated or harassed or coerced for your vote? What's the distinction between it being just wide open public knowledge and people voting by mail? I mean, can't the same things happen?
When you vote by mail,
Yes, I'm curious of what people think about this, because that is a situation. Somebody's, for example, a parent is a Trump supporter, and he tells his adult children who are living with him, or maybe not, I've got your ballots, and I want you to vote for Trump, and I want to watch you do it. So what's the distinction?
when I was running for public office, uh, my suspicion is that was done against me in the nursing home in town by the administration, because I was trying to, frankly, cut the funding for the hospital system, which was, we were funding 3 beds and giving them $600,000 a year out of the county budget for 3 beds. And I wanted to cut it in half, and I did successfully cut it in half. But when I ran for reelection, somehow the votes out of that nursing home were all for my opponent. So, it does happen. And I think it happened in that case. But I don't think that's common. I don't think it's common. I think we've gone overboard because of voter suppression. Yes, you have to have an ID. I really do agree that you should have an ID. But having an ID, you could have a utility bill. You should be able to show a utility bill. You should be able to show a lot of other things. People like you and I have got a driver's license. A lot of people, low income people, especially in big cities, they don't have a driver's license. They take a bus everywhere, and they may not even have an identity card. Because to get an identity card, you basically have to go to the driver's license bureau and say, I want an identity card, and go through the bureaucracy and through the wait. And I've done that with my elderly mother-in-law. So it's not that you can't do it. It's not, a lot of low income people don't have the resources to do that. And a lot of elderly people don't have the resources to do that because their licenses expire and so on. And if they're in nursing homes, there's nobody to take them. So in any case, I think it's a complex problem. And I think taking the politics out of it on the left and the right would help. For instance, if we had shorter voting lines in DeKalb County and Fulton County, there would be less reason to give people water on the waiting lines. In Fayette County, which is heavily Republican, probably 70% Republican here, I wait 5 minutes. And Jasper County, where I was an elected official, I waited 1 minute. In DeKalb County and Fulton County, which are heavily Black precincts, wait is 2 or 3 hours. Something needs to be done about that, and there needs to be a bipartisan push to do something about the lines. It needs to be a bipartisan push to make sure that voting is fair and honest, and it's not skewed according to what party you're voting for.
Well, the lines make perfect sense to me. Who wants to stand in line? It's not, I agree. I can't imagine anybody disagreeing with you, even though they might, for other reasons, want to set it up that way, Democrat or Republican. But the thing I'm curious about with the voting by mail is, you say that doesn't happen that often, but why remove that protection? Because that is a protection for many people, that you can't vote by mail. That's actually a protection for them. For example, an apathetic voter, they have every right not to vote, but yet people may intimidate the hell out of them for their vote, because now they know they can vote without being forced to go to the polls.
Well, I think there's a couple of different views on voting. There are some people that view voting as a privilege, and some people that view voting as a right. I view voting as a right. I think everyone ought to be automatically registered when they're born to vote, and they should show identification when they vote, but when they turn 18, they should be automatically admitted. Let me give you an example of the problems, and there is voter suppression. When I was 18, I was voting in the presidential election. It was Richard Nixon George Wallace and I believe Hubert Humphrey at the time. I was registering in Atlanta in the Piedmont area near Broadview Plaza. And one of the people registering people to vote in front of, I think it was a Kmart at the time, had a Wallace sticker on. And I was 18 and I said, "You're really a Wallace supporter?" And he said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Okay." Well, I went ahead and registered. And then miraculously, when I went to vote, I wasn't registered. He decided I didn't need to vote. And he just eliminated me because I asked him, was he really for Wallace? Well, number one, he's not supposed to be wearing the Wallace thing. That's actually a violation of law to do that, to be advocating for a candidate when you're registering people to vote. But again, it's pure voter suppression. And those kinds of things do happen. And, it's a problem when they happen on either side. Yeah, it's a problem if somebody's stuffing ballots, but it's also a problem if the ballot box is not accessible to people other than during voting hours. There's no reason the ballot box shouldn't be accessible to people if you really want people to vote.
If you're a close election, and is it unreasonable for people to distrust the results in a very close election simply because of this opportunity that you have with voting by mail to buy and sell votes, coerce, intimidate, observe, threaten people for their votes? Is that unreasonable?
I think if that happens, the people should be prosecuted that are doing it. But there have been very few instances of that happening. There were instances of that happening 100 years ago, which is why they closed the bars on election day, because people would be told, I'm going to buy you drinks all night long if you go and vote. But it's not happening nowadays. Nowadays, the exact opposite is happening. When Brian Kemp was Secretary of State and decided he was going to run for governor, he purged 500,000 voters in one day. The majority of them minority, because he knew he was going to run for governor, and then he won governor by 50,000 votes. So of the 300,000 minority voters that he dumped, how many of them would have gone to the polls? If 50,000 of them would have gone to the polls and voted against Kemp, Stacey Abrams would have won. That's an example of voter suppression.
Yes, but you can't. Yeah, I understand. So you eliminate all these other problems. There are no voter lines. There's you limit that. You eliminate these problems that you're referring to. Is it unreasonable for a person to distrust election results because this opportunity that people have with voting by mail? I know you say, I might have misunderstood you, but you can't say that doesn't happen. You're not saying that, are you?
I'm not saying it never happens, but I'm saying it's a rarity.
How do you know that?
There are some states, because there are some states like Utah and Oregon that everyone gets a mail-in ballot. Everyone automatically gets a mail-in ballot, and they're free to send it in. And I don't see widespread voter fraud in Utah.
I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about people being intimidated their
Romney
votes
really
by.
was elected, and I don't think people were intimidated into voting for Senator Romney.
How do you know that? Because it's in private. Mom's not going to turn dad in for harassing the hell out of her for a vote, is she?
It's also true that someone could bring their elderly mother to a voting booth and tell them, you need to vote this way, now go in and vote. It's possible. So yeah, it's possible that could happen. And it's possible someone could tell their elderly mother, fill out the ballot such and such a way.
To answer my question, you think it is unreasonable to have that mindset?
I think the entire voter fraud issue has been politicized by Donald Trump. And at this point, no one is objective about it. No one.
Well, I'm not referring to vote. I'm not referring to fraud. I'm talking about something that can't really be proven. You can't prove that a pastor in private wants to see their congregants ballots. That would be very difficult to prove, and it would take willing. It would take willing a participant, and also there's no proof that they voted for the person that they're being told to vote for.
Yeah, you bring up a good subject, which is religion and politics. I think religion and politics should stay completely separate, and they're not completely separate. They're not completely separate in Black churches, and they're not completely separate with people like Franklin Graham, who obviously is a conservative and asks people to vote a straight conservative ticket. I don't think that's right. I don't think that Reverend Dollar in College Park telling people to vote for Democrats is right. I think religion and politics should be entirely separate, and they're generally not.
See, don't you miss the day where you went in and you voted and no one knew who you voted for? You could vote whomever you wanted to, and it was completely confidential.
In terms of the confidentiality of the vote, yeah, it would be great in an ideal world if you could just go in and actually do it electronically and not even have a follow-up in writing, a hard copy. But with the potential for voter fraud from other countries like China and Iran and Russia, it would be irresponsible not to keep a hard copy.
Oh, no, I understand that. I mean, you could have a hard copy. They had hard copies. You went to a booth. I don't know what your experience is like, but you go in a booth, you close the curtain, you made your selections.
Right.
When you pulled the curtain, the votes went away. Even if I took a camera, a video camera, and took a photo of the ballot, my selections, it wouldn't mean anything because you couldn't see them until I could reverse them and pull the lever, and you would never know who I voted for. Do you kind of miss those days?
I think everybody misses days when things were simpler. Now they're much more complex. I mean, I miss the days when there was no controversy about the electoral college, and it was simply a rubber stamp. And Mike Pence was right with what he said. He said, I don't have a constitutional ability to change the vote. But I suspect that that's going to be very different in the future, that it's going to be heavily politicized. And I support the bills that Republicans have put in to codify the electoral college the way it is, so that you don't have a vice president, Democrat or Republican, that decides off the top of their head they're going to jimmy the votes. So frankly, our electoral system needs to be revised. We have an electoral system that was set up for when we were 13 colonies. We're not 13 colonies anymore. It was set up to help the small states so that they would join the United States. Otherwise, they wouldn't have. They'd have gone off on their own, and they didn't want to be bullied by the big states. But at this point, you've got Wyoming with the same number of senators as you do California, with 16 times the population. So Wyoming has got a much greater say per individual in the Senate than California. And when you expand this out over the entire country, you've got a very strange form of government here, one that they don't have anywhere else, and one that, frankly, in many instances is failing due to the gerrymandering and due to the way the Senate is structured.
One more question about the voting by mail, if you'll indulge me. See, if you vote by, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is your opinion that voting by mail, the convenience of voting by mail and more people voting outweighs this concern that some people have about their votes being observed?
Yeah, my opinion is it ought to be done the way that Utah and Oregon do it, which is to send out a mail-in ballot to everyone, and you have the option of mailing it in. I do mail-in ballots myself. I vote absentee because my wife was sick and she was not able to go. But it's a pain in the neck, and very, very often, it's easier just to go on into the voting booth here, where I've got a 5-minute wait. Now, if I was in DeKalb County and Fulton County, I would definitely be asking for an absentee ballot every time, because I'm not going to wait 3 hours in line to vote. So yeah, I think there's definitely a need for mail-in ballots.
Okay, I'll go into another column. There was you written a article about critical race theory. So I want to ask a question this way: should the notion of systemic racism be taught K through 12 in public schools in an uncritical manner?
In an uncritical manner, yes,
Sir.
it should be taught in an objective manner.
So it should not be taught in an uncritical manner.
It should not be taught in a biased manner, one way or the other. The facts should be portrayed, and the facts are, for instance, in the South, and my children and grandchildren are descendants of Confederate veterans, but there is an over glorification with Confederate statues of the Confederacy and what it stood for and why the Civil War was fought. And there's, on the other hand, there's a more of a glorification of slavery as being, it was us taking care of these people. And that's not historically correct. So I think history should be taught in an unbiased manner, leaving out the biases that are so easily transmitted within our culture.
I can't really say I disagree with anything that you said there, but for many people, the idea of systemic racism, I'll just read the definition: discrimination or unequal treatment on the basis of membership in a particular ethnic group arising from systems, structures, expectations that become established within society and institution. What this notion is that depending upon the skin color, you're an oppressed person or an oppressor, and you can't do anything about it.
I don't think that anyone should be told that they're an oppressor unless they're actually oppressing people.
That's the essence of the definition, though, isn't it?
That's part of critical race theory, but critical race theory is a legal concept.
I'm reading the actual definition. I'm a little confused about what you're saying.
Critical race theory is a theory that is taught in law schools. Critical race theory is not taught in any K through 12 schools.
I'm referring to the notion of systemic racism, which by the definition means there's an oppressor and there's an oppressed person depending upon their skin color. You're born into it, you can't do anything about it. That's the notion. Should that notion be taught to?
The fact that there has been broad oppression of minorities within the United States is a historical fact. It doesn't mean that every person that's white oppresses every person that's black. It doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be doing those things. But it does mean that systemic racism has existed in the United States since the beginning of the United States.
So
starting with the American natives, the indigenous population, who for large part were murdered because they were not white Anglos coming from Europe.
For example, I guess in school systems, they will look at the disciplinary infractions And if you, in certain school systems, you have to, the administration, school administrators have to present a plan to correct a disparity between groups on whether their discipline's taking place. They call it, I think it's, they're trying to achieve equity as opposed to treating each individual student equally. And so that's the kind of thing that's going on. Do you agree with that sort of thing? Because that's really the essence of systemic racism, isn't it?
Not the way I define it. I do agree with what your postulation that every individual ought to be treated equally, judged on their own acts. But I find that different than systemic racism. Systemic racism is what I said earlier about having Confederate memorials in counties that are majority Black in the state of Georgia, which actually is a fact. And not systemic racism is the state of Alabama fining the city of Montgomery, which is primarily Black, for removing a Confederate memorial statue. They fine them $27,000. That's systemic racism. And so it does exist. It doesn't mean that every white person is discriminating against every Black person. It also doesn't mean that Black people cannot be bigots. There's racism within the Black community. As his example of that is the number of incidents in New York City of Black men assaulting Asian women. It's a major issue within the city of New York, that those are the people, Asians, especially since the COVID pandemic, have been assaulted. It's mostly by Black men. So, and that's racist. So it can go a lot of different ways.
Well, I just want to be clear for the viewer. I was only reading the dictionary definition.
Yeah.
So, and that's my understanding of the dictionary definition. I appreciate you looking at that, and you have kind of your own definition, but I don't think that's what most people think of when they think of this. They're thinking of things such as in our criminal justice system, if you have a disparity, you have to fix it. You don't look at people individually. You look at them in groups, because there's a number of people that propose this. I mean, it's quite common, don't you think?
What's quite
that there's political groups that push for equitable outcomes. For example, in the criminal justice system, if you have a certain number of convictions with a person of this ethnicity, and the way, and then you have to correct those numbers. You're looking at people in terms of groups. In other words, you might be on a jury, and the culture is telling you that you can't think logically about the facts of the case. You have to weigh in factors that have nothing to do with the case.
Does
that make sense?
It's an extremely complex problem. It's the fact that more Black people are shot proportionately by police officers, that could be due to systemic racism, or it could be due to those, mostly Black men, responding differently to those officers. It's very difficult to answer questions like that without having actual research before you. The numbers. The numbers are many more Black men per capita are shot and killed by police that are stopping them. But do you know whether or not they're more
not
violent?
Absolutely.
You don't know.
But not absolutely. Maybe relatively, but not absolutely.
Not absolutely, but per capita, it's a fact that there are.
I don't think it's as big. My understanding is not that huge of a difference on that particular matter. But in terms of other crimes, I mean, it may be true, but it's also true that, for example, Asian Americans have far lower of instances per capita than Caucasian or African American, so forth. I'm sorry I didn't interject myself into that, but I wanted to clear that up for the viewer because I think you and I were saying the same thing. I have one more question because you've been so kind to take this time to talk to me. It's really been, I've really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate it. So the last thing I want to talk about was in the news, and you haven't written about it, but I suspect it might be something you might write about. So I was curious about your, is the idea that Twitter, Elon Musk asked this question on Twitter, because he's a pretty prolific user, that he considers Twitter the public square, and his basic comment was that if it's protected free speech, it should be allowed on Twitter. What do you think about that? Not in terms of whether it's a good business decision for Twitter or not, but just the idea, the concept.
Well, I think all of these companies are making business decisions. I mean, frankly, I was a corporate executive for 25 years in healthcare, and they were not making decisions based on quality of the health of the patient. They were making decisions made on the bottom line. And I think Facebook and Twitter and the others are doing the same exact thing. And Elon Musk is going to do the same thing. He's going to do whatever he feels like makes him money.
Well, so assume
is running off people on the far left and the far right because of censorship. And I've heard it from people on the left and the right about Twitter and Facebook. His philosophy is let everybody talk because he's going to make more money. And if that's what he wants to do, and he owns the company, fine. But I think that from a government standpoint, free speech is fine until it invades, my personal space.
How so?
In other words, if it creates violence against individuals,
that's not protected.
Then you should not have that. Is not, that's yelling fire in a crowded theater.
So you're saying to make a business decision. I'm really asking you what do you think about these companies, whether it's a good business decision or not? What do you think about them censoring people? That just didn't seem to be a thing to me 40 years ago. Censorship was based on, what I mean by that is censorship back then was based on primarily obscenity. It wasn't targeted towards political speech. So I guess my question is, does political speech, just your personal opinion, does it offend you?
I'm a very traditional libertarian about government and getting involved in regulating people as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. Give you an example. If somebody wants to smoke, fine, but they should not be smoking indoors in a restaurant or a bar where I'm sitting. If they want to smoke outside, fine. And I'm fine with people saying whatever they want to say, as long as it doesn't create a situation whereby you've got people being directly hurt by it. In those cases, then government should get involved.
I mean, yeah, you're not saying that there should be. I'm not hearing you say that the Constitution is, or the Supreme Court is interpreted that there should be additional classes of protected speech. I'm not hearing you say that.
No,
Okay.
I think what the Supreme Court has said so far has generally been reasonable, and it's been fairly balanced about free speech.
I guess what I'm getting at is I see on Twitter things in different social media for years, and I don't really use that stuff all that much, but when I do, I'll see things like hate speech needs to be censored because it's not free speech. And I read those things and I'm thinking, the person that writes them is pretty ignorant of what is allowed and what isn't, because what your hate speech is different than someone else's, and it's totally protected speech. All political speech is pretty much protected. And I think a lot of people don't get that. Do Do you see that also, or?
I'm an ACLU member, and ACLU stands for free speech. So I support free speech.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just, I was curious what you thought about that, because this is something that's going to come up over and over again.
I see a lot of nuts on the left and the right on Twitter and Facebook. My personal opinion is the best thing to do is to ignore those people. But are they ignored? No. I do think that the government has a responsibility when you're talking about militia groups that are violent to monitor what they're saying.
That's not protected, though. That's inciting violence. If you speech inciting violence, it's not protected.
Right. Right.
But if it's not inciting violence, then it is protected.
Yeah. And I think it should be protected. I think people should be able to say whatever ignorant things they want to say.
Right. Because you don't know. But don't you agree that you don't know, it validates your opinion? You always should question your opinion, and it kind of say, okay, well, that kind of validates my opinion if you think about it. Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking this time with me.
I've enjoyed it.
I hope you enjoyed it.
I did. I enjoyed it a lot. We ought to do this again sometime. Good question.
Good. Well, maybe we do it again sometime. So if you've been watching and listening to Different Take Podcast, please, if you like this content, subscribe, like, share, and appreciate you watching. New episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thank you.